Hear the Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the lake. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone out from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some of the people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. And he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha, cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and he told them to give her something to eat. This is the gospel of the Lord. So please be seated. Last week in the Gospel readings we heard about Jesus in the storm with his friends. And they're in the boat together and he was asleep. And they said, "Teacher, don't you care that we're about to drown?" And he said to them, "Why so scared?" And then he calmed the waves and the wind. And then they were really afraid. They said, "Who is this that can even command the wind and the waves?" In this story now, it follows on closely after that, and after another story which you've left out, about how he went over to a region that was lived in mainly, I think, by Greeks, or by people that weren't Israelites anyway. And there he found a man that was possessed by demons, and he was living in a tomb, and he was completely mad. It said he had no clothes on, he broke the chains that had been put on him to try and restrain him, and he scraped at himself with stones. And Jesus took the demons out of them, and the demons infested a large herd of pigs that was nearby, and they charged down and jumped into the sea. Now, if you like, these stories together show what you might call the extremes of experience. The things which terrify people. The storm at the sea, for one thing. The sailors, found it terrifying. They knew what the sea was and everything else, and they had the physical courage, if you like, for that kind of thing. But they also knew that they were helpless against the wind and the waves. There's nothing they can do about it. They just had to hope for the best. And then Jesus just calmed them. And with the man that was living in the tombs, that's about as the baddest thing to get. No one could control him, no one could restrain him, no one could heal him or deliver him. And he was completely mad. And then Jesus restored him to his right mind. And the people found him clothed, sitting, talking, looking normal. And that made them afraid. And they sent him away. And here now, we have another story. But this one is maybe not quite as alien as the previous two, something a bit closer to home. But it's meant to follow on. We're meant to carry on the impression of those other things with us as we hear this. Jairus is also afraid. He's in terrible fear. He's about to lose his child, whom he loves. If you've got children, you know what that feels like. There's always the time they don't make the call, or they don't phone up, or they don't turn up, or whatever. And you have that terrible fear clutches at your heart, and you just think, don't panic, it's going to be all right. And mostly there is. But things do happen. And then we're in that terrible sense of fear about we're about to lose someone that we love and care for, and we feel helpless. And poor Jairus was in that terrible state of fear. That he loved his child, his little girl, and he's about to lose her. Quite what he normally would have thought of Jesus, it doesn't really say. He obviously was a contentious person. He had aroused a large following. People were curious about him. But the people over by the tombs and by the herd of pigs, they just sent him away. They couldn't deal with it. The disciples in the boat with him were horrified. They were terrified by the fact that he could speak to the wind and the waves and instruct them and command them. But Jairus here, he doesn't really know him that well. He's probably just met him for the first time. But he has that desperate hope, that desperate longing that anything is worth trying to save his little girl. So he ran out to Jesus. I feel like he humiliated himself in public, bowing down to him, please come and help me. That desperate longing in his heart. And then as the crowd followed and jostled their way through, this woman came up behind him. She too had a desperate longing in her heart, but not quite the same. For 12 years she had been enduring this illness. Whatever discomfort or pain it brought, but also humiliation. Also should be, socially ostracised. Should be unclean, so she wouldn't be able to mix with her family and with the community properly. It's possible she wasn't even supposed to be in the crowd, because then other people might touch her and be ceremonially unclean by touching her. And that's the same with people with all kinds of diseases. Whenever you hear about lepers and other people in these stories, they're all in that same position of being, if you like, separated from the community because they've become unclean by these things. Particularly the man that's possessed by demons. In that case, you've got everything that could possibly go wrong. He's mad, he's living in a tomb, which is unclean, he's surrounded by pigs, which are unclean, and he's infested with demons, which are also unclean. He is absolutely at the depths of despair. He is absolutely surrounded by the most appalling circumstances the writers could think of. So from that point of view, this is comparatively normal. But still, she must feel keenly her sense of pain and this ongoing humiliation and suffering. She too has this longing to be delivered, this longing to get back to normal, this longing to get back to her family, to her neighbours. And so in her longing, she dare not even confide in him. She can't approach him openly for some reason. But secretly in her heart, she just thinks, if I just touch his coat, his cloak, if I just touch the corner of his clothing, I'll be okay. And she was right. It echoes a bit in the Psalms where it says, cover me with your hem of your robe, O Lord, a symbol of protection. And sometimes I think that when we baptise our children, we're kind of doing that. We're covering our little ones with the hem of our clothing to protect them with the covenant of baptism until they can make up their own minds to know the Lord. And so, we make these decisions for them. So she wants to be covered by the hem of his garment. She wants to be covered with his cloak. Jesus, as an observant Israelite, would have had little tassels on the corner of his cloak. Tzitzit, they call it. And it was said there was a little blue thread that would run through each one so that they would finger it and so they'd see it and they'd handle it, so they'd remember the 5 books of Moses, the law and the prophets. So she reached out to him and touched him. And Jesus felt something happen. And immediately turned around. "What's going on?" he said. "Who touched me?" And to the spectators, it must have just seemed ridiculous. I mean, what do you mean, who touched you? All kinds of people are jostling up against you. But that's not what he meant. Who touched me? Who reached out to me? Who had faith in me? Who believed in me? What's happening? And it's curious in a way that he didn't actually know, because at other times in the Gospels, of course, he knows these things intuitively. He's given, if you like, divine insight or spiritual insight into things which other people normally wouldn't know. But here, he doesn't actually seem to know. Either that, or he wants the woman to come out into the open. He wants her to be seen. And so she came out trembling and afraid. Another story of fear now. Now she's afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of the mob? Afraid of the crowd? Afraid he's going to be angry with her? That added to her humiliation and shame and her suffering over the years. She's now going to be sort of the victim of this mob of hatred, of whatever. And he blesses her. "Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your faith has saved you," he says. "You are saved." Why? Because you believed in me. But in the meantime, the little girl has died. Now the wailers have started up in the house, and a message comes to Jairus. The thing which you are afraid for, the thing which terrified you, the thing which moved you to come out and search for this man at the desperate last hope, it has happened. And now it's too late. He must have felt that crushing despair then, that terrible sense of loss. And then Jesus said, "Don't be afraid. Just believe." And so they carried on. And this whole story has the air of someone who was actually there. The way this is described, someone who was actually there, walking with them, actually related this to the writer. Mark doesn't actually pretend to be there. So it could well be that he heard this from Peter, who was there. Because Peter was invited into the house with James and John, and with the girl's parents, to come and see what Jesus did. And Peter must have heard those words, "Talitha kumi." Little girl, arise, stand up. One thing which I found about this story, which perplexes me, which kind of, I don't know, it kind of tantalises me. There's something there, but I can't quite work it out. I've got a dictionary of Aramaic, and in my dictionary I looked up the word Talitha, and then right next to it is the word Talith. The word Talith is the word for the coat, the cloak that Jesus was wearing. I hadn't twigged before. The two words are almost the same. The woman, with her longing, in her desperation, reached out and touched Jesus' talith. And then the little girl, the Talitha, Jesus said, "Rise up." Both these things are about the people being saved. The little girl being saved from death. Jairus being saved from his grief, from his loss and his despair. The woman being saved from her illness, from her status as an outcast. The people having their hopes met extraordinarily, beyond human expectation. People had already done what they could. The little girl had died. No one could stop her illness. The woman's illness rumbled on for 12 long years and no one could help her. They were beyond human help. People could do nothing. And Jairus and the woman were helpless. And they knew they were helpless. There was nothing they could do. And in their extremity, in their last hope, they cried out to the Lord. And in that respect, it's like the psalm and like that reading from Lamentations we heard. I often read this verse out at funerals. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And Jairus must have known those words. But what must he have thought about them when he woke up that morning and see his little girl was about to die? What must that have meant to the woman who had been ill for 12 years to hear that the Lord's mercies are new every morning? She must have grown up with those words. What would they have meant to her for 12 years of suffering? And then it says, the Lord will not reject forever. Although he causes grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. On this day, Jesus certainly did display his steadfast love, the abundance of his compassion, and he delivered them. He saved them. I actually use that word, he saved them. You are saved, he said to the woman. And I suppose part of the reason that this was written for us is partly because Peter remembered vividly that afternoon and he described it in detail to his friend Mark. Partly so we know that these things happened. But I think we're asked to enter those stories. We're asked to put ourselves in them. And think, where are we like Jairus? Where do we feel that desperate fear of loss or grief? Where are we like that woman with the hemorrhage? Where do we feel that longing to be delivered, to be helped, to be set free, to be healed? Now, all of us at times will carry these burdens in us. And I think the story invites us to come in and join these characters and think, how do we pour out our hearts, our longings, our fears to the Lord? And we can remember from the previous stories how Jesus commanded the wind and the waves, and he said, don't be so afraid. And in all these stories, there are stories of fear. People are afraid of the unknown and afraid of the things they can't deal with. And I think we're meant to remember Jesus said to his friends, why so afraid? I'm with you. And he is with them. And he's with us by his Spirit. And so when the things press in on us, the things which make us afraid, or the things which fill our heart with longing for release, that longing for deliverance, for healing, we can remember that he is with us, that his mercies are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness, that he has not abandoned us, he has not cast us off, and he never will. He's even promised to turn it round. Weeping may spend the night, but joy comes in the morning. There's many references in Scripture to the idea that while we endure these things, it's like the night of weeping. But we do so because we know that joy comes in the morning. I think we're invited to know this, to believe this with all our hearts, that joy comes in the morning. That while weeping may well endure for the night, the morning will come. And then we who wept will be filled with joy. That is the hope the Lord gives us. And as we pour out our hearts to him, he promises that we will see the morning. We will know the joy. And that hope is meant to sustain us. And there will be times when he will hear our prayers. When as we pour out the longings of our hearts, our fears and our desires, he will simply answer them. And we'll be astonished. Because beyond all earthly expectation, beyond all human help, he's actually done it. He did something which we just didn't think was possible. because occasionally it happens. Sometimes it really happens. But we can never tell quite how or when or why. If you like, it's a mystery. And we're invited to, if you like, become part of this mystery of not knowing, because it's about faith. He wants us to believe in him, and trust in him, and hope in him, and persevere in him. So we're never given quite that certainty, except the certainty of hope and faith, and the knowledge that joy comes in the morning. That is our certainty. And that is how he wants us to live. Thank you, everyone. May the Lord bless you as you live in that certainty that joy will come in the morning.